Hey, how you doing? My name is Tim Wright. This is the Western School of Initiatic Gnosis and Theosophical Mysteries. This is the first time I've ever done this in this format. You can see that the video quality is getting better. The graphics are getting better. And definitely the content is getting better. So I'm not quite sure what's going to come out. I just thought I'd go live with everyone, anyone who was interested. I have to the left of me, wait, that's the right. It's my left, but it is going to point right. So this will look weird. To the left of me, over there. Anyway, so to the left hand, we have a sigil, as you can see. It's the first time I've ever talked about this publicly, and I'm not anybody important in it. I am an enthusiast of this group that you're seeing right there. And I'm not going to say what the name of the group is. If you know, you know. This is one of the initiatic groups from history. And as you'll see in previous videos about the 7 rays and how they've gone down and kind of helped us in humanity to get accustomed to these, this is the active theurgical group that they are teaching us how to interact with the world as it exists in the realm of the spirit, I would say. So this is a sigil that came from Prunel de Lier in the 18th century. I've just been corrected that when something's in the 1700s, it's the 18th century. And Prunel de Lier was a student of a French master in his time. And it's a profound opportunity to even be able to talk about things like this. So I thought I would just do a live video real quick. I don't know how long it's going to go. Next to me, I have a book that I printed called Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings into Their Original Divine Spiritual Properties, Virtues, and Powers. So that is something that is very near and dear to me, that I was going to do a little bit of conversing with you guys on. It's the initiatic tradition, which I find the most interesting, the most obscure, and definitely the most profound and deep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the book, and we're going to go to a section of this treatise, and we're just going to have a chat. I don't know what's going to come out. I have no clue what we're going to talk about. I don't have really an agenda. My agenda is primarily to talk about this tradition that we're seeing here in the sigil. So maybe we can open it up, and I'll tell you about the section that I popped open to, which is Enoch. This is section 4 of this treatise, and it's about Enoch. Now, if you know this stuff, you know this stuff. If not, you don't. And that's okay, too, because I think anybody who really uses a spiritual text can derive up to a few meanings in that text. The first one, obviously, is the literal word. Since this was a French 18th century document, it's highly unlikely that the English version is going to convey what the original French did. So the letter of the words aren't really going to be like whammo, you're going to get illumination from the letter. But what I like about this text is it's broken into paragraphs. So when you break it into paragraphs like that, you can put a chunk, and then you can attempt to understand what that paragraph is trying to say. So much like the essence of it. And then there's a couple other levels. The other level that I wanted to talk about is the comparative, and that is kind of like the theosophical level, where you're gonna go ahead and look at this, and then you're gonna look at how has this idea played out through history in the history of religio-spiritual traditions. That is super important, because as Mircea Eliade says, the reason why something is sacred is because it has a profound hierophany, is what he calls it. And that hierophany is comprised of mythological, a psychological, and a deeper non-local state of sacredness, of specialness. So it may be something that you've gone through in some kind of play, a dramatic play. These are what they called initiations. They would do dramatic, and they weren't plays in the beginning. As you'll see in Dr. Louis Kaiser's book, Initiation, Ancient and Modern, the original initiations were not done as a self-awareness, transcendent principle so you can learn it in kind of a movie form. Nobody gets hurt. In fact, some of the original mysteries and initiations in particular, they would have you go through a very dark period of bodily deprivation. They would have you go through this rite of deprivation of your body's needs. You wouldn't really have a place of ultimate satiation that you would go to. You wouldn't be satiated at all. You would be hungry. You would be. You wouldn't have sex. You would not have had much. Some societies, which I've talked about in the past, they will actually deprive you of light. They will put you in the dark, such as the Taoist societies. They'll put you in a dark, not room, but as Ming Dao, I think his name, no, Hua is he's the master of the Dragon Gate. I don't know his name immediately, and I apologize that I don't know his name immediately. I could go to books, but I'm just going off of memory. Anyway, the master of the Dragon Gate, the current one, translated by Cleary, his story, he talks about going through this tremendously dark period of his initiations into the immortals that he learned in the Taoist tradition. Learned, meaning not like he studied a book, but learned as in had an experience of these immortals in the Taoist tradition. Which is very, very profound to read, and it kind of makes me extremely grateful to even have a small glimpse of what that tradition is about. But primarily, what would happen is you would be deprived of all light, of all sensory kind of experience, and you would be put into, well, he was put into a cage. It's a book called Entering the Dragon Gate, and you can read it. But he was put into a cage, and in that cage he was stuck. He couldn't get out. And what they did is he talks about how he almost went insane in that cage. He went through a experience of light deprivation and a kind of a deprivation that is really, really difficult to go through for multiple days. But comparatively, you want to talk about how the tradition hierophanically, I think that's the word. It's hierophany is what Mircea Eliade said. So in a hierophany, what you're looking at is how this sacredness spans through all kinds of different traditions. And I also found in Tibetan Buddhism the same kind of light deprivation. If you'll go through your Vajrayana Buddhist teachings, you'll start to see how there was a form of light deprivation that these Vajrayana Buddhists went through. They had a Bardo retreat. A Bardo coming from the word gap in Tibetan. And this gap, this period that they were in this place, they were not able to experience the regularities of life. And in this deprivation, they were experiencing some pretty interesting stuff. So they went through a deprivation of light as well. Also, if you want to get a public book by Peter Kingsley, In the Dark Places of Wisdom is what that book is called. And he talks about how in the original tradition of the Pythagoreans, they were in Italy, they were in a form of light deprivation as well. In Italy, the Parmenides philosophy was derived from a incubation that you went through in his system, not his, but the system that he talked about, where you would go through a light deprivation, and in that light deprivation you would have an experience of the dark places of wisdom. And that's super important. This dark place of wisdom where you go and you are able to bring forth a kind of knowledge, a experiential knowledge of being in that dark place. Then you can bring it forward and you can start to show people what exactly it is here that you got going on. Pretty profound stuff. So I particularly like those traditions where you go into a experience of deprivation. Oh, and the other thing this reminded me of when I heard about it in Taoism is the tradition of Hermes Trismegistus. In the Alexandrian knowledge of the Hermetic groups, and these aren't the Hermetic groups of like some kind of organization in the late 19th century, but they're a Hermetic group that existed in the first century and that you can read about through Hermeticism, they kind of call it, where it was about Hermes. It was about the teachings of the ancient Hermetic priests. And in this teaching, they started to talk about, in the first book, the general doctrine of Hermes Trismegistus. And as you would go through an experience of trying to connect with this Hermes, you would be deprived. You wouldn't eat very much. You would fast. And when you were ready, you would approach this, not entity, but you would approach this energy and you would approach this experience with a similar kind of understanding. So what happens when we have gone through this history of these experiences and these people who have gone, these people that have gone through them, we start to see that there's a commonality. There's a commonality. If you move into, I got a book in there in my room by Eugene Whitworth and the Jaguar Prince, and talking about how the Mesoamerican initiations are very similar. Very similar. You go through a light deprivation, and in that light deprivation, you have an experience of a deity, whether it's mythopoetical or tribal, cultural. You could have an experience of that deity through a sensory kind of enmeshment or engrossed experience with that deity. All kinds of different ways that the sacred comes into our lives and talks to us. You know, and some people have chosen the sacred as a form of what gifts the sacred brings. As far as antiquity, we have they're called homonyms, and this was talked about by Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed, where he talks about how there's these gifts that are given to you by connection through the different methodologies of these schools. One was called the school of the days of Genesis, and the other was the school of the work of the chariot, generally speaking. And as you went through these initiations, as you went through these understandings and expansions of knowledge, as Torquem Serdarian talks about, and of course I'm being anachronistic. These are not, starting from here, going all the way to here. These are jumping around all over the place where you're learning of the same general vibe that's happening. That's the third level. The third level is the comparative religio-spiritual information and experience of the archetype. And as the archetype goes through the experience of recapitulation of all these deep down sacred understandings through mind, body, and soul, there's what I believe to be called the initiation. And the initiation is when the archetype, it's hard to say, and it's not hard to say because I don't know it. It's hard to say because I don't kind of want to go there. But basically, Jung's understanding was that the archetype is an experience of all of us conscious human beings understanding what it's like to be a conscious human being. And as that archetype understands what all of us understand, then it is able to interact with that which gave it its being. So it starts to get really Basilidian when we're going into these levels of ultimate reality, which is what I think this book particularly is about. It talks about a form of creationism, and it talks about emanation. I paused for a second because I have a firm understanding of a lot of these things. It's not difficult to get a grounding when you comparatively look at all the traditions of history. If you go back through time, you will start to pick up the seed thoughts, the mysteries of each and every tradition. They'll implant it. Now, maybe it won't come to fruition, but what will happen is you'll have an experience of I don't want to call it gnosis. It's not gnosis because you don't really do anything, but you definitely you pop out of your previous knowledge of the situation and of the realm that you understood it in, and what I like to call epistemology, and you get a new form of expression for that language and myth, so to speak. So it's pretty profound stuff. Like if you go through the Judeo-Christian myth, story or experience, whatever you want to call it, you'll start to have more and more of these recapitulations of the things that they're talking about. One of the major ones was the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount talked about these really, really high principles to very, very common people. I think it's Hans Dieter Betz in his Hermania. I think it's called Hermania. It's hard to say. It's a collection of commentaries on the Judeo-Christian Bible. In it, I know it's Hans Dieter Betz. Betz talks about these really nuggets of information that are passed in the Sermon on the Mount, and that they didn't come from that time. They came from a tradition prior to that time. So they were being put into a new form and spoken to human beings of that particular configuration of the archetype. And when that happened, there was a new understanding. There was a new cycle that went through. The season, so to speak, had gone all the way through its germination, and it started to bear fruit. So that's what initiations do. They never change. They're always the same. But the people who experience them put new clothing. They put new fashions on them. They experience them in their own particular constitution, and then they share those. Almost every initiation is shared. And there's those that make you think that they are not, but they absolutely are. In fact, for an initiation to be valid, it has to be substantiated by the collective. That's super important. You can't just have your own self-initiation, and not to bag on anyone who's had a self-initiation, there definitely are, but they're never individual in the sense that they don't get shared, that they don't get spread. The good news, the Evangelion, it's not just for you. You don't get good news all by yourself, hoarding your knowledge or whatever of an initiation. That's not how it happens. It can't ripen that way. So that's how an initiation, as Stephen Heller says, that Gnosis, in his book Gnosticism, and I think it's called A New Light on Gnosticism, that Stephen Heller wrote, tremendously good book. And he talks about how Gnosticism, after you go through the acquisition phase, you'll go through an amplification phase. You'll acquire all this new terminology, all this myth, all of these experiences. You'll go through all of this new stuff, and it has to be new for the recapitulation to work. So it'll be new, then it'll awaken when this was also new at another time. When you go to such a high psychic frenzy, maybe like we're seeing over there, when you go through a high psychic frenzy, you reach a point of the bursting forth of your recapitulation of that particular psychic realm. And as you go through the psychic realm and you experience this thing for the very first time again, you now have a way to convey it that doesn't just bring the force of that one time, but it brings the force of all of the death and all of the energy that was placed into this container at another time. In Buddhism, they like to say that a pot that has garlic and onions in it will remain to have garlic and onions in it until you completely clean it out. And it's funny how they say that, but I really like that phrase because it's like I was talking with a friend today, and you got a cast iron skillet, and anybody who has a cast iron kind of way of cooking knows that you don't scrub the cast iron completely clean. That's not how you cook with a cast iron, pan. You basically you wash it clean so it's clean, but you don't scrub off the residue of what makes that cast iron so special, which is the fact that meal after meal it seasons. So the initiatic experience is kind of like having a cast iron being that is taking on every one of these gnosis drops of oil and flavoring that gets put into it, and then every time you amplify it, you go through Heller's cycle of amplification, you now have an experience that you can share with others. It's really yummy to eat. You can have a bite of it, and everybody's like, "Oh, what's this flavor?" And you're like, "That's not in the recipe. That was from a time that I made another recipe." And now you're experiencing subtle hints of distinguishing of that flavor. And this is what I like about my jambalaya. I put it in a gigantic pot, a crater, so to speak, and you put it in the pot and you make the jambalaya, and it brings on the andouille sausage flavor that it's not the current andouille that you cooked into it. It's the andouille that you have cooked into it 3 cooks ago. That makes it so powerful. So I did not know we were going to talk about that. And there's a reason why I went into that tirade. But you're going to have to be in the know to understand what all that meant. And hopefully you are. I really, really, really hope you are. Go and seek out this. There's a phrase that the Rosicrucians, they don't hide from anyone who seeks them. In the I think it was the Fama, they talk about, or the Confessio, one of them, they talk about how you're not going to be blocked off from this. If you really go and seek out these teachings, you're going to find someone that's going to drop some flavor, so to speak, quote, into your bucket. You're going to start to ripen and amplify with teachings like this. And that's what the Western School of Initiatic Gnosis and Theosophical Mysteries is about. You are not going to pay me for lessons. I'm not going to have a curriculum to where you're going to have to pay to get to a paywall, and then you have to pay to get beyond that paywall. That's not what it's about for me. What this is about is sharing with the community. Maybe Rosicrucians, maybe magicians, maybe philosophers, maybe occultists, and just maybe one of the people that want to see it on Facebook and are like, what is this stuff called initiation? You're going to get to experience this. I guarantee it. By looking at, that kind of stuff, you're going to experience it. The image has a life of its own. And when you look at an image such as the one over there, you don't necessarily just look with your eyes at the image, like my teacher, who I constantly talk about, says, what you look at also looks at you. Just to give a moment of silence for the Sige there. What you look at looks at you as well. So you can't necessarily, I can't necessarily look at a picture and then think, oh, I see this, and I see a that, and I see a this, and I see a that. But really seeing it is seeing it with the mind's eye, is seeing it with the eye of wisdom, of seeing it with the eye of the initiate, the eye that is built in initiatic systems. So, in this book it says, let's see, Enoch, an example of the divine spirit and its action. I just opened it up. It's page 57 of the book. If you know what it is, great. If you don't, go and find out. I told you the title. Among the miners destined for these kinds of spiritual operations, we shall first consider Enoch, the seventh of his generation who replaced Abel, namely the generation of Seth. He is by rank of birth a true example of the divine spirit for the support, conduct, and defense of the miners against persecution by the demons. By the mission, work, and worship that he professed, he is also an example of the true type of direct action of the doubly powerful spirit which at that time laid down for men and women the conduct necessary to protect them from the attacks by their enemies. The same conduct was to guide them in their natural, temporal, and spiritual operations, and to serve as a fundamental basis in the rituals of their worship conforming to divinity. Now, we don't hear something like that in the story of Enoch. However, if you are in the stream of the esoteric talking people, you'll hear that Enoch is absolutely revered in Gnosticism, that there are books in the Nag Hammadi and apocryphal libraries that are absolutely about Enoch. Then you'll also read about people who experience the archetype of Enoch. And there's a lot going on there. You know, if you have eyes to see, there is a lot going on. So something like this, you get a spiritual text, you go through the comparison, and it usually happens like this. In French, that sentence doesn't mean anything to me. In English, I can kind of get a look at what's being talked about. Throughout history, there have been people like an Enoch who have done these things with people like that. And they have been influenced by forces that are talked about. As that happens, we start to get into the fourth layer of amplification, and the experience amplifies. Once the amplification happens, that is why we read these books. That is why we have these talks. And that is why I'm so grateful to be able to be here and chat with y'all. Okay. Thanks for checking out my new digs. I got this video going on like this, and I think we did pretty good with the volume and the video and everything, and I'll take a look at it. Delete it if not.